Hello, is this clickbait? A little bit. I'm so sorry. But actually, it's also a little bit true. Okay, I think there's lots of ways in which we misunderstand, underinterpret, overinterpret the Bible. We proof text, we springboard, we put the cart before the horse, we have lists of irrelevant texts that we attach to things. There's lots of ways that we do, me included, use the Bible unhelpfully. But there's one thing I think youth workers and children's workers are particularly guilty of, and that's moving the character spotlight, moving the protagonist spotlight from God to the person in the story, the human in the story. So I was once asked to edit a resource for a well-known Christian youth work group in the UK, and I was sent the story of David and Goliath, and the teaching said, David defeated Goliath because he was strong, he was able, he knew who he was and his identity was sure, therefore he defeated Goliath. No! How do you take a story about God's power, God's sovereignty, God's awesomeness, God's extraordinary ability to use ordinary people, and his faithfulness through David? It was David's zeal for God that consumed him. How do you take that story and make it about humanism? But this is the problem. When we look at a story, especially in the Old Testament, in a lot of resources, we have a habit of making it about the character in the story rather than the character of the story. And this is quite a modern thing that we do. If you were a Greek reader, I mean, obviously this is Old Testament, but if you were a Greek reader, if you were reading Homer's Odyssey, you'd understand that characters in these stories were used to lift up and prop up the divinity part of the story. So if I ask you a question like, what's Noah's Ark about? I'm assuming if you're writing a resource, you'll talk about Noah and the boat and the animals and the rainbow, and you might even say Noah was wise and good and godly and righteous when everyone else was rubbish, and that's all fine, but not the point of the story. The point of the story is God. God is powerful, God is holy, God is just, God is merciful, God is able to do immeasurably more than we can think or imagine. The story is about God. The story of Joseph is not about, oh, Joseph gets sold into slavery and put down a pit and then he has these dreams. It's again the story of God's faithfulness in the middle of incredible hardships. The story of Job is not about Job's suffering, but God's faithfulness and majesty at the end of the story. When you read an Old Testament story, really any story from the Bible, but this is particularly true in the Old Testament, you should be asking, what does this teach us about God? Not what can we teach empathetically about the character. Empathizing with characters is great, but if you're reading Joseph and you're reading therefore be faithful like Joseph was faithful, or be sinless and righteous like Noah was sinless and righteous, or have a heart after God like David had a heart after God, you're going to find it very hard to live that way. You need to not look to your side at a fellow human and figure out what they were doing and try to imitate it. You need to see what they're looking at. David was faithful because God was faithful to him. You need to look at the same God, not look at David's actions. They're helpful, but not the point. The story of the Bible is God's story. And all of the illustrations in it illustrate important, essential attributes of God's character and ways in which we as creatures, as people, relate to him. It's helpful to see how others related to him or didn't. It's helpful to do character surveys, but that's not the point. I think we read the Bible hugely incorrectly when we make that the main thing. So my encouragement to you today is really simple. Every time you read a Bible story, to teach it, to lead a group session, or to preach, or to do a talk, or give an illustration, always ask the question, what does this passage teach me about God? Before you say, how can we learn from the individual in it? I think it's a significant interpretation difference that's more than just a nuance. It changes the meaning of a lot of these texts. And if we don't do this right, the issue is it amplifies the human, it devalues God, and then it makes the human our place of application. So we have to copy what they did or not copy what they did, rather than looking at who God is and having that well up into us as an authentic, long-lasting response in worship and obedience to God. That was a bit of a waffly phrase. My point is, it's different when you look at where you're aiming and look at where they were aiming, rather than looking at the person next to you and trying to aim like they're aiming. Like, if you've got a gun and they've got a gun, it helps to look at the same thing together rather than looking at where they're aiming. When it comes to the Bible, always ask the question, what does it tell me about God, before you move on to character arcs and empathy, emphasis, and those sorts of things. So there's my thing today. Yeah, I think we teach the Bible wrong quite a lot, because we often individualistically focus on the character rather than the larger story, the larger protagonist, which is God himself. Whew, bit waffly, bit ranty, and I'll stop there.